We read in the document Veritatis Splendor, paragraph 44, quote, "The Church has often made reference to the Thomistic doctrine of the natural law, including it in her own teaching on morality." And what this means is that as far as the Church is concerned, the foundation for the Church's understanding of the natural law is Thomistic, that is, it's based upon the writings of St. Thomas. But it also means more than that. It means that the Church's understanding of the natural law is more developed than St. Thomas's, which is actually the case. So it's founded on St. Thomas, so the principles are all there, but the conclusions and the development actually the Church developed over the course of time. And everybody kind of knew this, it's just that nobody really mentioned it until Veritatis Splendor came out. But the natural law rests upon what our understanding of human nature is. And that is where the real problem exists today. Not necessarily among everybody in the medical community, but just in general. People have a flawed misunderstanding of the term nature. So in point in fact, the term nature, if you look at the different ways that it's used, actually has several different meanings. The first is habit. When we say, it's just second nature. So we try and do something repeatedly until it becomes easy for us, and then we call it second nature. Another one is from the Greek word physis, which means physical. So when we say something is natural in the sense of it's something that's just physical. So, for example, the physical laws of the universe, or we say natural laws, but they're not natural law in the more restricted sense as applied to human beings. Because it's true that God has a set of laws or intentions regarding the whole of created nature, but how they apply to man is different, as we'll see as time goes on. The next is, so that this would be like some things like physical laws. The third is the sum total of all creation. And in this case, we make distinctions between, for example, the natural and the supernatural. So human beings are natural. God's grace, or the infused virtue of faith, is something that's supernatural. So these are things that are just purely on a natural level. There's nothing above and beyond nature regarding them. So even the angels, everything from the angels to the lowest rocks, or whatever the case is, are part of the sum total of creation. That is, they're part of nature in that respect. Another is that which often happens, or happens for the most part. So, for instance, we say the fact that all men sin, except Our Lady, of course, and our Lord. But they say all men sin. So it's natural for man to sin. Not exactly, it's actually unnatural for man, but the fact that it tends to happen a lot. Or that it's natural for man to die. Actually, it's not. It's not natural for his soul to be separated from his body. Although St. Thomas says that given the current state of matter, it's natural for the body to tend towards dissolution. That is, to basically dissipate, and eventually just the person dies from it. So it's not natural on the side of the soul, but it is natural on the side of the body to kind of head towards this chaotic state. Then you have also disposition, is sometimes called natural. So for instance, when you say this person has a specific disposition, so it's natural to him. For instance, the sanguine disposition, it's natural for the sanguine disposition to like food and to eat a lot. And so sometimes the term disposition is used as the term natural. But none of these are actually what we mean when we mean the natural law as it's applied to man. When we're talking about the natural law as it's applied to man, we're talking about the essence of man. And what does this mean? The natural law, or the natural indicates a fundamental ordinance. It's a direction, it's a guiding which God places in our nature, and He inclines us or moves us towards specific kinds of things. And so the natural law here means, in fact, the term nature in philosophy is defined as the essence of a thing, as it is a principle of motion. So what's this mean? Well, what's an essence? First we have to ask that question. Well, an essence is what the thing is. So what a dog is very different from what a human being is, or for what an ape is. And so when we look at what they are, we recognize in looking at what they are they're designed to perform different kinds of activities. And so what happens with the natural law is that God, when he creates man's human nature, he designed man to function in a specific way. So it's good for a dog to bark and bite. Now human beings can bark and bite, but you might say, oh, there's something a little off with the guy. But normally, human beings, since the definition of a human being is a rational animal, he's supposed to do what? He's supposed to proceed by rational discourse, not go around barking and biting to convince people. So the point being is that dogs are designed to do specific things, and human beings are designed to do different kinds of things. Another example is a car. The nature of a car, the essence of a car, is to be able to go from point A to point B under the guidance of a driver. I mean, that's the nature of the thing. Here, via the ground, of course. We're not talking about like an airplane or something. But the nature of a car is to go from point A to point B via the ground under the guidance of a driver. So that means that what? You design the car a specific way to perform that function, that is to go from point A to point B. So that design includes tires, because you're going along the ground and you want to do it efficiently, a motor, because you got to be able to move, and a guidance system, that is a steering system to actually help you to do it. All the other amenities in a car are actually for what? For the comfort or for the convenience or for the knowledge of the driver, so that it's ultimately ordered towards what? The driver and his ability to go from point A to point B. So you look at the nature of a car, and then that tells you what the intention is behind the person who designed it. Well, the natural law is the same way when you apply it to man. When you look at man's nature, you see he's structured and designed in a specific way so that he can perform specific kinds of actions. And God fashioned human nature, fashioned man when he designed it. God wanted a specific kind of sets of activities. So in relationship to, let's back up, with respect to angels, he just wanted them to think and to will. They don't have bodies. And so as a result, that's what they're designed to do. Whereas with human beings, we can think, will, eat, engage in conjugal relations, these types of things. And so God intended to how man behaves is going to be different than obviously than an angel, because our natures are different, because he structured us and designed us. Now, this nature, in designing it to perform specific kinds of actions, actions are always means to an end. And so it means that as it's a mean to an end, it means that God designed us to function specific kinds of actions, which are means, to achieve a specific end. And St. Thomas says that all of the actions that we perform, all of them, or that we're capable of performing, are ultimately ordered. So even all our faculties and all the ordinance within man is ultimately ordered so that man achieves God in the end. And so that the ultimate action which God wanted for us is to see him face to face. And that means that all the actions that we perform have to fall under that end, because that's what God intended. Otherwise, it goes aside from what God intended. Now, St. Thomas says that the natural law is something which we don't actually have access directly to the mind of God, he says. So, hopefully this thing's not going to kill me here. He says that the natural law differs from what's in God's mind in this sense. In God, he says, there's the eternal law. And what the eternal law is, it's the conception that God has. That is, it's his intentions and what he wants and what he thinks about the whole created order and the whole providential plan. But the only people who have access to this are God and the blessed in heaven, who see him face to face. They can see it in him. But we don't have access to that, but rather the eternal law is expressed through basically three kinds of laws. The first is the natural law. So we know what God intends by looking at the nature of the thing that he created. So like dogs, we know what he intended for dogs. He wanted them to go around and, scavenge food or whatever the case is by the fact that he designed their faculties to perform a specific set of functions. And human beings are also the same way. So we know what human beings are designed for, that is, what God's intention is based upon the way He made us. Just as you know what the intention of the automobile manufacturer is regarding specific features in a car by looking at it and seeing how it functions, and then we recognize, okay, this is ordered towards so that I can listen to music or something of this sort. And that's how we know the eternal law. What God is actually thinking is expressed through the natural law. And then, of course, there's also the civil law, insofar as ultimately God can determine who's ever in charge of anything. He can allow good people and bad people in, but the civil laws are ultimately one of the ways which God governs us indirectly. Now, there can be bad civil laws, but St. Thomas says bad civil laws are not true laws. But good civil laws are actually a governance which God had intended. He intended us to live in communities and to be governed, because if we're not governed, then it's chaotic, as we saw recently in New Orleans, when the civil government tends to break down. But then there's also what they call the divine positive law. And this is the law which God has to come and tell us Himself. For instance, part of the natural law is for men to worship God. The problem is that we're pretty stupid, and we don't know God very well. And so He's got to come down and tell us, no, don't do this, do that. So, for example, it's analogous to this. If you've never met me, and you're coming over to my house for dinner because I've heard about you and I want to get a chance to know you, but I don't know you at all, really, when it comes down to it, other than by name. And for dinner I thought, well, I think you're going to like bat brains for dinner and squid intestines and things like this, and that's what you're going to like. Well, when you get over there, other than being repulsed at the dinner, you're going to be a little insulted that I didn't bother to consult you beforehand on what you tend to like and dislike. Well, it's the same thing with God. We're not going to know how to worship Him, so we can't fulfill even the natural law unless He tells us how to do it with respect to certain circumstances. And this divine positive law is what's known through revelation. Okay, so you need revelation in order to finally fulfill the natural law inclinations. But this understanding the mind of God through the natural law, because we can understand what His intention is really what this whole set of conferences is going to be on. Now, I'm not going to talk about God too much. In fact, this discussion of God is going to be out of the picture for now, because really the natural law, you can discuss it in itself, except for in a couple of rare cases without much reference to God. I mean, the foundation for it, yes, but the actual content, you can know much of it without any reference to God. There is, therefore, okay, so the natural law is natural. The natural law is this ordinance or this structure that God builds into human nature to direct man towards specific kinds of activities. And that's God's will, because He created us this way. If He wanted to do it any other way, wanted us to do other things, He would have created us in different ways. So if we act contrary to the natural law, then we go contrary to the mind of God, and in fact it's called sin. In fact, every sin, like for instance when you look at the Ten Commandments, St. Thomas in his Summa Contra Gentiles argues to all of the Ten Commandments based purely on the natural light of reason, without any recourse to revelation. Which means what? That the Ten Commandments and much of the stuff in the Old Testament, and even some of the stuff that Christ said in the New Testament, is in fact God's revealing to us the nature of the natural law. The Ten Commandments are, this is what man is structured and designed to do and not to do. All right. There is, therefore, in this fundamental ordering of the natural law, what they call the principle of operation. And what this means is that the nature of a thing determines what kinds of acts it's capable of performing and what kind of acts it should perform. And this is going to be the whole discussion when we get to the bioethics part. So the principle of operation, so the essence of a thing then again determines what the thing is, determines how it's supposed to behave. Since, therefore, this ordinance is rooted in our nature, or our essence, we need to discuss what that essence is and what human nature is. And that involves discussing the structure and nature of the structure of human nature. Human beings are composed of body and soul. The Council of Vienna, I always want to say Vienna because we have an apostolate in Vienna, the fraternity does, but the Council of Vienna says that the soul is the substantial form of the body. Now, what that means is that the soul makes this body be a human body and function according to a human mode, rather than like a dog's body, because a dog has a different kind of soul. In fact, the term soul just means principle of life. So this principle of life, the soul actually makes the body alive. It is a common misperception that life is the result of chemical operations. That's just false. God can retract the soul from the body and it'll go lifeless just like that. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be some residual chemical operations, but the fact of the matter is that if God retracts the soul, the person will die. Normally, however, there is what they call the hylomorphic theory, and that is that the soul, which is what they call the form, and the form is what makes the body be a specific kind of a body. So the form of a dog, or of a cat, or of a rock is different from the human form, which is the soul. Normally, though, the soul isn't put the way it's designed, because it has to actually be supernatural by a miracle if it works otherwise. But God set up the natural order so that the material dispositions, how the matter is arranged and how it's working, determines which forms can actually be there. So, for instance, in the case of I give an example. You can take the form of corn. All right, so it's got a material disposition, it's arranged in a specific way, and it's got the form of corn. I hack it down and then I eat it, it's digested, it's broken down, it ceases having the form, that is the structure and nature of corn, and now it comes into being a human being, so then it takes on the form of the human being. So the point is, though, is that the soul informs the body and makes it function and be a specific kind. So this man is a composite of these two. They work together. In fact, St. Thomas says it means they're one substance. It means they're one thing. Ultimately, when they come together, they're distinct. They're really distinct because one's spiritual and the other one's material. But nevertheless, they come together to form one human being. It's not like you say, well, my body's here, my soul's over there. And this is going to have a big impact when you start talking about things like transsexual operations. Because you hear people say, I'm a man trapped, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. Well, in point in fact, we'll see later, this is not possible when you're looking at the actual nature of man. From this body and soul arises faculties, of which there are two kinds. And a faculty is just the ability of this thing to operate. It's the ability of the thing to do something. And these faculties are either a composite, that is, they're material and immaterial, or they're strictly just immaterial. St. Thomas says that basically the disposition of the faculties determines how you could even say the dispositions of the bodily organs determines how the soul operates through the body. Because really, the activities that we perform as human beings are actually actions of the soul done through the body. It's not just, bodies walking around. It's actually the soul operating through the body. And so that's why there's always an immaterial side to the material operations. So, for example, part of the intellect, not all of it, we'll see this a little bit later, but part of the intellect is material. We know that. Why? You smack somebody on the head and they lose their memory. Or, you give them a lobotomy and they just don't function. So we know that some of their intellectual operations are strapped or dependent upon the material side of the human being. But again, it's the soul operating through this. So if the material dispositions of the body aren't properly arranged, the soul can't operate well through it. And health is a disposition. So ultimately, the goal of the doctor is to get the body to have the proper dispositions so that the person can engage in normal operations that should occur through the body. But then there are certain operations that we perform, or certain actions we perform that are immaterial, completely immaterial. Free choice is immaterial. Why? Because it's not subject to physical laws. If the will was something physical, it would be subject to physical laws. There are certain kinds of intellectual things that we do that are also completely immaterial. For instance, self-reflection, the ability for a faculty to turn back on itself and see itself. So for example, the fact that we can know that we know. I mean, that sounds like a philosopher's line, you know. We know that we can know. You know. But the point is, the fact that we can reflect upon ourselves, dogs and animals and cats can't do that because they don't have the spiritual faculty that can bend back on itself. So self-knowledge is actually something that's proper to something that's strictly immaterial. Okay, so these faculties then, some of them are habituatable. You can have habits in them. So for example, when you go to medical school, there's two things that you're trying to achieve and have them in the science, so putting aside the artistic part of it. But the science part of it consists of two things. It consists in the raw data. You need to have the information. So you need to be exposed to the actual information that goes along with this. You know, the various chemical operations, the various organs, things of this sort. But being able to look at that information and understanding it are two different things. And so St. Thomas says it's both the data plus the ability to judge the data. So for example, my cousin has a doctorate in biochemistry. We can both look at a cell, we can both look at the same data. But what he sees in it is very different from what I see in it because I don't have the same intellectual habits that he does. Or another, we all know about habits, you know, when we get bad habits, we eat too much, we talk too much, whatever the case is, as far as vices. And these habits are either bad, that is, they tend to make it difficult for us to say no to them, or they tend to be virtues, which gives the ability of the person. The virtues do two things. They perfect the individual, they make you good. You know, a virtuous man is a good man. And they also make acting, it's easy to act well or easily. Okay, so there's some faculties that have habits. Some of them do not. The only ones that have habits are those which are under our control, which we'll see those in a little bit. Then these habits determine a specific kind of action. So if you remember, I said that the nature of a thing, so this is man's nature, is ordered towards specific kinds of actions, and that's via the faculties. God designs in the human being faculties so they can perform these functions. And these actions are, of course, good or bad or whatever the case is. And then these actions, St. Thomas says, are specified by their object. And what's that? Different faculties have different things about which they're concerned. So for example, the intellect, its proper object is the true. The will, its proper object is the good. That's what it's designed or ordered for. That's what God directs it towards in its very structure and nature. Then we have what we call the concupiscible appetite, which is the appetite ordered towards bodily goods. And this includes some sub-faculties, namely what? The nutritive faculty, we want to eat. It also includes the generative faculty, that is, we're ordered towards specific kinds of objects, that is, it's ordered towards what? Conjugal relations. So this is the structure that God has actually built into this. Now habits, in between habits and actions, or actually between faculties, habits and actions, is what we call a disposition. Now a disposition, again, is the arrangement of the matter. It's how the matter is arranged within the thing which determines how well it can act, the soul can act through the body. As I mentioned before, health is a disposition. In fact, that's one of St. Thomas's classic examples. Okay, so we have all these faculties. Of those which are a composite, so I got an E on that or not? It does, okay. I actually wrote 3 books on psychology, and I do have a theory as to why you get up to a board and you can't write, but anyway. Of those which are a composite, there are several of these. The lowest one on the rung is called the nutritive faculty. And this is the one which actually supplies nutrients to the body. And this would include, everything from the lungs to the stomach to all the things that provide the nutrients to the body. So the specific different organs don't necessarily determine the specific kind of faculty. Rather, the organs are designed so that the faculty can operate through them and do specific things. Then there's what we call the augmentative faculty. And this one, it will become quite important in the discussion of conception. The augmentative faculty is the faculty which has the ability for the thing to grow. Now, the process of healing is actually a product of one or both, most properly, the nutritive faculty. Then there is the generative faculty. And this is the one which, we reproduce through. Another one is called the locomotive faculty. It's not a train, of course. But here we're talking about, it's the one that makes us able to move locally. So, for example, someone who is a quadriplegic can't move, his locomotive faculties become restricted because the disposition of his body isn't there in order for him to be able, for the soul to be able to act through it. So, like plants have everything from the nutritive to the generative. Animals have locomotive in all of these, whereas human beings, however, have a bit more than that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But then there's also what we call the appetites. And the appetites, here we're not talking about he's hungry. We're not talking about that, even though it's connected to that. An appetite is an inclination towards some type of bodily good. So an appetite, for example, that's one of its definitions. It has also a broader definition, but I don't want to get too much into that. But so, for instance, the concupiscible appetite is ordered towards bodily good. So it's ordered towards eating and things of this sort. And these parts of there's part of the nutritive faculty we don't have any rational control over. And the same thing with the augmentative faculty. The generative faculty there's certain aspects of which we have volitional control and certain parts of it we don't. The locomotive we have volitional control over. And the appetites, St. Thomas says you have to rule them by persuasion. He says we don't have dictatorial control over our appetites like we do our limbs. We can move our arms when we want. But the appetites are those things which have emotions, or what we call passions. For example, desire, delight, hope is actually in the irascible appetite, or anger is in the irascible appetite. And so these things are actually there. And these, again, so this means that God, in designing the appetites, intended for us to have a specific kind of appetitive life. But since they're designed, because there's this principle, whatever in the intellect, or the appetites are moved by the presence of their object. And the appetites are moved by what's in your imagination. So I always tell people, if your emotional life is out of control, you've got to get control over what floats through your imagination. And that's something that's quite important. Because we can have control over what's in our imagination, and then by determining what comes through our imagination, we indirectly affect our emotional life. And God designed our emotional life, because just remember, in Adam and Eve, they had what they called the preternatural gift of integrity, which meant that the body was perfectly subordinate to reason, which meant that the emotional life always proceeded from reason and never went before or contrary to reason. So, and that is actually a goal that's attainable. The more virtuous you become, you'll notice that the more your appetites won't react until reason says to react. Okay, but then there's also part of the intellectual, but there's what in philosophy we call the passive intellect. The intellect is actually a single faculty composing three parts, but the passive intellect is that part. It's basically the brain. It's the intellectual operations that function through the brain, which is a bodily organ. Now, St. Thomas says that in this life, in order to make use of the immaterial parts of the intellect, which we'll see a little bit later, you got to have the use of your passive intellect. So, but in the next life, he says, well, you're not going to have it anymore because you don't have a brain anymore. So, but he says, but you do think, and he says, in the next life, we'll be able to actually think without without this lower part of the faculty, that is, this material part. Okay. Then there is those which are strictly immaterial. The first is called the agent intellect, but I'm not going to get into that too much. It's just it's the part of us which abstracts concepts. It's the thing that helps us to grasp things abstractly. It produces the abstract concepts. But then there's what we call the possible intellect. Now these might seem like strange names, but they all have their root in Latin. But the possible intellect is the one which gives me the ability to understand myself, to think about things, to reason, things like this, which is not purely the product of the brain. Because to think of an abstract concept is something, you have to lift it out of matter, because anytime something's in matter, it's always particular and concrete. So to think of it abstractly, you got to lift it out of matter, and that's what the agent intellect does, and then you think about it on an abstract level, and that's what the possible intellect does. But then there is also the will. The fact that it's free, that it's not determined to one thing or another, means that it's immaterial, it's not bound by physical laws. Okay, this is an awful lot of information, but this is human nature in a nutshell, according to the Thomistic understanding. Once you understand these and then understand what they're ordered towards, as I said, like the intellect is ordered towards knowing the true, and the appetites are ordered towards bodily goods and things like that. Once you understand what this structure is, then you know what God had intended regarding it. And that's the real problem that we're struggling against. The Catholic Church is against a lot of the secular things. They don't understand human nature, and they don't understand how we're designed or function. And so when you tell people, like for instance, contraception's immoral, they can only think of the secular profane benefits that they get from it. No, it seems fine. But they don't understand, well, if you look at the structure of man, God's will seems to be otherwise. Therefore, the natural law is an ordinance which God placed in all of this, directing it towards specific goods or specific ends or specific things. And it's an ordinance in relationship in which one is directed, pointed, or guarded towards something. So we're designed to function on things outside of us, and sometimes take them into ourselves, but just we're ordered towards something outside of ourselves. And St. Thomas says that all of these faculties ultimately, the lower ones ultimately serve our intellect, and the will, so that ultimately they can do what? All of these things are ordered and directed towards God in the end, knowing God. How do we know what this ordinance actually is? Well, St. Thomas says, okay, so we know what this structure is. How do I know which actions actually pertain to this? Well, that's where we start finding out a little bit more about the nature of the natural law. The natural law, what the inclinations are of the natural law, St. Thomas says are in three categories. So in other words, when I look at these faculties and see what they're directed and designed for, I recognize that they fall under three categories. The first is that which is ordered towards the conservation of our being. He says this is what we have in common with everything that exists. Even a rock wants to conserve its being, but want in the sense of that's taken generically, but it's ordered towards it. But this conservation of our being, I usually put this conservatio esse, which is in Latin. By the way, the reason sometimes it's hard for me to actually do a lecture like this is I'm used to teaching guys who have had 3 to 4 years of Latin and that have had 2 to 3 years of philosophy. So by the time they get into my class, I don't have to stop and explain anything. So if I'm jumping over something, you're like, what does that mean? That's why. Okay, the conservation of our being, we're ordered towards protecting ourselves, to keep ourselves integrally intact as it is, St. Thomas says. So if you look at, like for instance, if you throw a rock at somebody, what do? There's this natural inclination to just put their hands up or whatever the case is to protect themselves. Suicide is something that's against the first category of natural inclination. Why? Because we're not designed to commit suicide. We're not structured for that. Then the next one is that which we have in common with other animals. And here St. Thomas has in mind things like eating, reproducing, raising children. Now obviously, again, the nature determines how these categories function. So you don't raise a human being because it has a different nature the same way you do a cow. I mean, I know some people would like to, but you can't do that. All right, because they're not designed the same way. And this means that that there are certain things that are going to be proper to human beings because we're a different kind of an animal. We're a rational animal, that is, we're an animal with an immaterial soul which has this ability to see God. We're designed and structured differently than other animals. And we're not just an advanced animal. If you remember when I said will, the possible intellect and will, we perform different kinds of functions than animals do. Animals only really have the highest activity that an animal has is the ability to make associations. And that's why, and some of that's pretty high up there in some cases, like so when they see, some ape taking a reed and sticking it in there, see, look, they're just like human beings, they use tools. No, the use of something, they've associated with this stick the fact that they can put it down this hole and they'll pull out ants. They don't understand the nature of an ant. They don't understand their own nature. So we perform different kinds. And how do we know this? They don't build schools and roads and establish governments and talk about justice and things of this sort because they're not designed for it. All right. But there are certain things we do have in common with them in those things, but they're particular to us. So how the natural law governs us, even in this, differs from, say, cows and dogs and things of that sort. Then there is, he says, that which is proper to the life of reason. And this means that human beings, because we have reason, there's certain inclinations which God has designed us for. For example, to know the truth. Oops. He designed our intellect to know what the truth is. He also designed us to live in common. Obviously, the medical profession is something that's utterly incapable of being passed on and being able to be employed in without a community. I mean, that's one of the signs of it. So there's certain things, and this is why man is designed to have actually civil governments and things like this. So when people say things like, anarchy rules, well, no, it doesn't, because in the end, we're not really designed to not living or to live in common without rules or without guidance, because otherwise we just mayhem breaks out. And one of the last ones he says is to know God. Okay. These are the three categories. So when I want to go from knowing, or when I want to know what am I supposed to do, then what I do is, one of the first things I do is I look at these three categories of natural inclination. So some things, whether we can know whether they're right or wrong just by comparing them to the three categories. Suicide is contrary to the first category of natural inclination. Killing your young is contrary to rearing your children. Lying to people is contrary to the natural law because people are ordered towards knowing the true. And the faculty of speech, which is a combination of faculties, but the faculty of speech is ordered towards speaking the true. Things like this. Shooting people is contrary to living in common. So sometimes you can just know what's contrary to the natural just by looking at this. But St. Thomas says that there's a distinction between what he calls the first precepts of practical reason, the first precepts. And he says, of the natural law, the first precepts of the natural law. And what a precept is, it's a command. Do this or don't do that. That's what a precept is. Now he says, of the first precepts, everybody gets it. As long as they have the use of reason, they understand what these principles are. Once you tell them, of course. They may not understand them explicitly until you tell them. So for example, do good and avoid evil. He says everybody gets that. Even when you have people say, no, I like doing bad things. Well, what you're doing is you're perceiving the bad as good. So the point being is that how do I go from the first precepts, do good and avoid evil, to no contraception? Because that's a bit of a thing. And sometimes you could say, well, contraception is common towards reproduction, but sometimes you need a bit more than that. And sometimes for somebody who has a lot of background, you can usually take an action, just compare it to this, and you immediately know whether it's moral or immoral. But human beings are pretty clueless. I mean, one of the reasons we have revelations is because we're so clueless about what to do. So God comes down and says, look, don't do this. You know, I always said, being a guardian angel is analogous to taking care of a dog that you can't get under control. Don't do that. No, not that. Do that. Oh, yeah, that was good. No. Stay away from that. You know, it's that type of thing. All right. So how do I go from the first precepts to the secondary, what they call the secondary precepts? And the secondary precepts are formulations of concrete actions. Don't contracept, don't fornicate, don't commit adultery. How do I go from the first precepts to the second? Well, the first thing I do is I can compare it to this. And if I compare it to this, sometimes I know I don't need to go any further. But sometimes that's not enough. So St. Thomas says you have to look at the structure and the nature of the faculties in which these are categorized. So you have to look at the structure of the faculties. When I look at the faculties, I see they're designed in a specific way to perform a specific kind of an action. So once I know what those once I know what that structure is, I know the kinds of actions that God intended in relationship to that structure. Then the next one is, and this is what we're going to talk quite a bit about when we get to the bioethical section. Then the last one is sometimes even that's not enough. It's not real clear. So then St. Thomas says, you just look. If it creates virtue, that is, it makes it easier to do, that is, you can do the thing well, and also that you have more rational control over it, then it's a virtue. And so that means it's fitting your faculties, because the virtues are things that they fit the nature of our faculties. Whereas vices weaken the faculty and make it harder not to do it. Whereas if I have a virtue, I can do it or not do it. Whereas with a vice, I kind of get locked into the thing and I can't really do anything else. So he says, this is how you actually, in the end up determining what is moral or immoral. So this is the structure and the nature of the natural law. I know what God's intention is about what is sinful and what's not sinful by comparing it to these three categories, or by looking at the faculties, or determining whether it begets virtue or vice in the specific faculty to which it relates. And that's how I know whether something's right or wrong. And so what we're going to do is then in the next conference, we'll unpack a few other moral principles you need to know so that you can apply what I just got done talking about in the natural law to the actual area of bioethics. Okay.